President Biden just left California, but in a brand new interview out today, he said he believes he could have won the 2024 election if he'd stayed the nominee. USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page asked President Biden point blank, quote, "Do you believe you could have won in November?" Biden replies, quote, "It's presumptuous to say that, but I think yes, based on the polling that." Biden trails off, and then Page asks again, "Do you think you would have had the vigor to serve another 4 years in office?" Biden says, "I don't know." He then goes on to say, quote, "I really thought I had the best chance of beating him, but I also wasn't looking to be president when I was 85 years old, 86 years old," unquote. I want to bring in the woman who interviewed President Biden. USA Today's Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page is here. Also with us, Kate Bedingfield, who was Biden's former White House communications director until 2023. David Axelrod is with us also. He was a senior advisor to President Obama. So Susan, first of all, what was your main takeaway from your interview with President Biden?
Well, he wants to make the case that these recent controversies over his health, over his pardon of his son, should not be all that defines his legacy. So he wanted to make the case that his legacy is broader and more consequential than that. It's also clear he's not quite ready to leave the Oval Office. I did the last print interview with George W. Bush. He was ready to leave the Oval Office. Joe Biden wishes he had 4 more years.
Well, Bush got 8 years. So that's one big thing. What do you make about this claim that he would have won if he had stayed the nominee?
That's not the conventional political wisdom that he could have won. The conventional wisdom is that he was in a place where he was not likely to win if he stayed in the race after that disastrous debate. And so he is at odds with the opinions of most politicians in that. But I thought more extraordinary than that, because politicians, you don't become president unless you have all the confidence in yourself. More extraordinary than that to me was his admission that he's not sure he could have served 4 more years.
Yeah, that is quite an admission, because obviously when you run for president, you're running to be president for 4 years. You're not running for 2. And I never heard him say, "I'm going to run for 2 years and then step down." David and Kate, I'll start with you. Do you know of any polling that he's referring to that actually bears out this idea that the polling indicated he would have beat Trump? I know of only data to the contrary.
Yeah, look, I didn't see any polling at the time when he decided to drop out that would have suggested he would have won. That's kind of the tricky thing about polling, though, and this is an argument that we were having at the time he was dropping out. Polling can't tell you definitively what's going to happen 4 months, 6 months from now. But no, was there polling at the time he decided to drop that suggested he would have won that race? No. But look, Susan's absolutely right. Nobody becomes president of the United States without a sense of confidence. Some would say a sense of ego. And I think, what would you expect him to say? Of course, he's going to say that he thinks that he could have won. I would have loved to see him answer that question in a way that didn't necessarily make it the driving headline coming out of the piece, because there were so many other things that I thought articulated really well in terms of defending his record and his legacy. But sometimes he's just going to say what he thinks.
Always. He says what he
Or
thinks,
he's always
that guy. But I mean, look, I remember George W. Bush saying to me when he was a governor, "I'm not going to walk through a minefield of hypotheticals." I mean, that's an answer for him next time.
Exactly. Or, hey, does it matter now?
Right.
Which is another way.
Well, it's also kind of a slam on Vice President Harris in a way, David, because she obviously didn't win.
Yeah, and let's be honest, one of the reasons she didn't win was because she was seen as as the number 2 official in the Biden administration, and this was a judgment about fairly or not, this was a judgment about the Biden administration. Kate's right, you can't project 4 months ahead in polling, but we know what polling was on election day, and Joe Biden had a 40% approval rating. I don't think there's a president who's won re-election with an approval rating that low. So you look, one has to comfort oneself in these moments, and that's probably what he's doing. But I think it's nuts to think that he would have won that election. The bigger thing, though, is this notion that I don't know about, what I'll be like when I'm 85 and 86. That was the whole concern years in advance. And it wasn't a judgment about Joe Biden. It was a judgment about the human species, that was an actuarial concern that was very real, that you when you're that old in a job this hard, that it's doubtful that one can go full steam for another 4 years. And that was a concern that he blew through when he decided to run. And the shame of it is, I think a lot of the accomplishments that he is proud of deserve the attention that they're not getting now. And they're not getting that attention because of the way he ended and the bad decision he made to run and to persist. Had he chosen a different path, I think he would have a different set of circumstances right now.
Susan, you also asked President Biden if he would issue preemptive pardons for those who are in the crosshairs of President-elect Trump. Former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, the former director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, Dr. Anthony Fauci. And Biden said, quote, well, a little bit of it depends on who he, meaning Trump, puts in what positions. So tell us more about that interaction and what that might mean.
You know, he talked a little about what he told Trump when the two men met a week after Election Day in the Oval Office for almost 2 hours. And he said he encouraged Trump to drop this idea of retribution. He said it wasn't going to serve Trump's own purposes to do that. And he said that Trump did not say he was going to follow Biden's advice, but he didn't dispute him. He listened to what he had to say. I thought that was interesting. The other interesting thing about him talking about that meeting with Trump, and we don't know much about what went on in that meeting, he said that Trump praised his economic record. Now, Trump has been nothing but relentlessly critical of Joe Biden on the economy and everything else, but Biden said, I had a good record.
Kate, do you think Biden should issue these preemptive pardons to Liz Cheney, Anthony Fauci, et cetera?
I personally have not been a fan of this. I think by its nature, if you're issuing a preemptive pardon, you're suggesting that somebody did something wrong. There's an element of admission of guilt that comes with a pardon. I also think there are questions about whether a preemptive pardon would stand up in court in different situations. So I haven't been a huge fan of it, but I certainly understand, given everything that Trump has said about what he intends to do with the presidency and with his government. I can understand the reason for it, but again, to me, it's an admission of guilt that I think is unnecessary.
All right, thanks to all of you. Really appreciate it. Congratulations, Susan, on the interview. Great stuff.